I'm Allison Stanger, Director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs at Middlebury College, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Sandy Spector back to Middlebury. Leonard S., or Sandy Spector, is Deputy Director of the Monterey Institute of International Studies Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and he leads the center's Washington, D.C. office. He's a renowned author of multiple books and numerous articles on issues related to proliferation. He holds a J.D. degree from Yale Law School and an undergraduate degree, we'll forgive him for this, from Williams College. He joined the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, or CNS, from the U.S. Department of Energy, where he served as an Assistant Deputy Administrator for Arms Control and Nonproliferation at the National Nuclear Security Administration. Prior to his tenure at DOE, Spector served as Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Director of its Nuclear Nonproliferation Project. He has served as Chief Counsel to the U.S. Senate Energy and Proliferation Subcommittee, where he assisted in drafting the Nuclear Nonproliferation Act and the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Just a word to students out there who might be interested in careers in nonproliferation or in internships at CNS. We'll be reconvening in this room at 10:15 tomorrow for an informal conversation about that. So if anybody's interested in that, please see me afterwards and we'll add you to our list. It'll just be a very informal discussion on the topic. But tonight, our eyes are trained on the proliferation threat itself, on the substantive issues. Mr. Spector's talk is intriguingly entitled Iran, South Asia, and North Korea, Meeting the Proliferation Threat. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sandy Spector.
Well, it's often important to turn on your microphone, yes. It's often useful to start a program like this with a humorous comment. I apparently had one here quite unintentionally. I do not mean to deter this diverse audience. And I didn't mean to put this up as a test pattern. This is something maybe we can come to in the question and answers when we get into why it is the United States still has nuclear weapons. And it's a very interesting matrix that we can talk about. What I'm going to do is turn that off just for a second and then speak a little bit by way of introduction on a number of topics that will turn it off. There we go. Great. I wanted to say a few words, first of all, about the Center for Nonproliferation Studies where I work. It is part of the Monterey Institute of International Studies, which, as you know, is affiliated now with Middlebury University. Middlebury College. We're very excited about that. We have a research group of about 40 individuals, 30 of them, people like myself, more junior, some graduate students in Monterey, about 30 some odd there. We have 8 of us in Washington, D.C., and there's a small office in Almaty, Kazakhstan, where we have 2 researchers who help us with some of our work on the post-Soviet proliferation challenges. We are the largest organization, actually, in the world that is outside of government that does training and analysis exclusively on proliferation issues. And we have specialists on chemical, nuclear, biological, missile proliferation, terrorism, and many of the regions where these issues arise, such as Northeast Asia or South Asia or the Middle East. A lot of my colleagues do a good deal of teaching. The Monterey staff, which is, as I say, associated with the Monterey Institute, which grants 2-year master's degrees in various international affairs topics. Most of my senior colleagues are on the faculty, so they're teaching part-time and researching part-time. And in Washington, many of my colleagues are teaching at Washington area schools like George Washington or Georgetown, and one colleague actually teaches at the University of Pittsburgh. So we're very interested not only in the research side, but also in the instructional side of this topic. And we're very interested in all of you joining us in this endeavor. So we have internships and other kinds of programs that you all might. We ought to kind of refresh our memories about some of the basics. And what we're going to find as we talk about some of the specific countries is that there is the same story that we're going to hear over and over again in some respects. And this is the story of how countries that have the idea that they would like to have nuclear weapons, how they sort of move forward to try to acquire them. These weapons always require the secret ingredient, fissile material, of which there are two kinds that have been used in nuclear weapons, highly enriched uranium or plutonium. Every country, every terrorist organization that might want nuclear weapons has to have these materials. They will not go off without fissile material, which basically are atoms of uranium or plutonium that will break apart very easily and release lots and lots of energy. So to actually do this, a country, and I think this making it is beyond the ability of terrorist groups, but a country has to build a whole chain of facilities. It has to have uranium access mines. It has to make the uranium into a gas, perhaps, to enrich it, or make it into fuel for a reactor or what have you. And then it has to work its way up the chain until it can actually produce this material. So we did it during the Manhattan Project. The Russian Soviet Union did it during the late 1940s. Britain, France, China all went through the same drill. And you can go back and look at the histories. The reactors are identified and the different facilities are there. Since that time, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, so that's 9 countries altogether, have actually succeeded in going up this ladder. Today, Iran, as we probably all know, is giving some pretty serious thought to this, and it is partway up the chain, or up the ladder, and we'll look pretty closely at where it stands today and how efforts are being mounted to try to discourage it from going all the way. Iraq, it was interested in the 1980s, much more than we appreciated. It lost, the war after it had invaded Kuwait. It was pushed back in 1991. Inspectors found all kinds of things they didn't anticipate, which showed much more progress on nuclear weapons than we had thought. And again, the same stuff, uranium, different facilities, and an effort to work it their way to the end point of getting fissile materials. The most important point to remember, though, is that the story doesn't always come out the same way, and that's the key. That's what nuclear nonproliferation is all about. It's getting the other outcome of the story, the outcome where the country says, this is too hard to do, or there are too many pressures on us to stop, or, gee, that enemy we had is no longer really an enemy, and we can give this up and turn to other endeavors. And there have been many success stories. And I think I'll just list them, and maybe we can comment on them in the question and answer period. But if you go back, there are factors that lead countries to change. Domestic politics, for example. Here was the breakup of the Soviet Union. Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine wound up with huge nuclear arsenals that just happened to be on their territory because that's where the Soviets based these weapons. Each of them, for domestic political reasons and because of outside encouragement, renounced these weapons and handed them back to Russia. So there was just one successor nuclear weapon state out of the Soviet Union, which broke into 15 countries all told. Ukraine wavered. Some in Ukraine said, well, let's hold on to these things. They may come in handy. They had a negotiation, and they gave them up. But domestic politics matter. This was debated in the Ukrainian parliament. Argentina and Brazil had military governments. They were kind of interested in the grandeur of having nuclear weapons, the prestige and the symbolism they represented, even though these countries didn't really have enemies. But those governments changed. The military in Argentina was discredited after the Falklands War in 1982. In Brazil, there was an evolution toward democratic government. And sure enough, things changed. They renounced this program they had, which was working its way up the ladder, and decided to start inspecting each other. And that's it. It's over. It's not part of the current problem at all. South Africa had nuclear weapons. It had a change of government, not from the apartheid government to the black majority government, but the intermediate government. The liberal white government of Frederick de Klerk decided that circumstances had changed in its region. The Soviet Union was no longer a factor in Southern Africa. South Africa needed to integrate its economy into the world and not be subject to sanctions. And so that change, both external and internal in the South African case, led them to renounce an actual nuclear weapon. I should have listed them as one of the countries that acquired nuclear weapons, the same route that we'll talk about in a minute, but then decided to renounce because of changed circumstances. And in Iran today, we have a domestic political situation which is incredibly important. As we'll hear, as I'll describe, there was a good intermediate restrained outcome for this very dangerous program in Iran, which the previous president, Khatami, more or less endorsed, and we were working it out. They had an election. A much more radical president came to power, Ahmadinejad, and he had different views. He wants to confront the West and really push this program forward. So domestic politics matter, and as I say, the outcome changes depending on a lot of these factors. Diplomatic efforts from the outside can change attitudes as well. South Korea had a nuclear weapon program in 1976, but it wanted to keep the United States as an ally. I mean, we were really defending it. It decided it was smarter to stick with us than to go down the road of independent nuclear capability. Taiwan, similar decision around the same time. The most recent case, and we just won't have time to go into it tonight, is Libya under Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi was under sanctions for decades because of terrorist activity and kept chasing after weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, missiles, and eventually nuclear. The supremely important shipment was coming to Libya. It was all the stuff, the bomb design, the whole factory needed to make a lot of the fissile material, and it was intercepted. All of a sudden he was confronted by this, and he realized it was much smarter to renounce this weapon he was never going to get probably, and become integrated into the world society. He did that, and sanctions were lifted that we had and other countries had, and you can now go to sessions of the U.S.-Libya Business Council in Washington because things have changed so much. So just to reiterate the point, there is one way that countries travel to get the bomb, but they don't always go all the way. And what all of us at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies and much of your government and governments around the world are set out to do is to try to deflect countries from this path, ideally through diplomatic means and persuasion and international treaties and the like, occasionally by more forceful means. So let's take a look at some of the actual ways this gets done, because you need to know, what people are fighting over in these different countries, what they want, what we're trying to stop them from doing, and so forth. And if I can get my my slides to work, let's see here. Okay, there we are. This is, let me go into a more elegant mode here so you don't see my leakage of my paper there. Here we go. These are uranium enrichment centrifuges. So actually more than I planned to put up there, I guess, because there's a little bit of blurriness. But there were two fissile materials that I mentioned, highly enriched uranium and plutonium. So in highly enriched uranium, you have to take uranium out of the ground, which only has less than 1% of the easily splittable, fissionable atoms of uranium that you want, uranium-235, and you need to concentrate it so that a product comes out with, say, 80 or 90% of that particular kind of uranium atom. This is extremely difficult to do. It's one of the hardest technological feats around, and over the years, different technologies have been used. But the one that is au courant, that everyone is chasing after today, and it's the must-have technology of the new century, are uranium enrichment centrifuges. So these are a little hard to explain, but if you look at on the left, you'll see these are large metal cylinders, and they all seem to be connected with pipes, or they are, even if you can't quite tell. What you're seeing is the outside of the cylindrical centrifuge. On the inside, in this rather blurry middle picture, is something that rotates. It's a vertical cylinder rotating extremely rapidly. Some of them rotate at supersonic speeds. And into that, uranium gas is introduced. By the way, that means a country has to have uranium. It has to be able to gasify it. So that's a second facility it needs. And then it needs a facility full of these things, uranium enrichment centrifuges. Basically, the heavier atoms of uranium, uranium-238, slides just a little bit closer to the outer edge, and uranium-235, which is what you want, are closer to the central shaft there, and it's more or less siphoned off. But then you do this over and over and over and over again. And the illustration on the right-hand side mentions a number of parts. The top rotor end cap, the top end flange, the vacuum housing, the rotor, the bottom rotor end cap, baffles, product withdrawal scoops, and so forth, special magnets so that when this thing spins it doesn't have any friction. There's a vacuum inside so that there's no friction on the spinning device either. These are incredibly complex machines, but they are unfortunately now available on a clandestine international market, or perhaps not now, but until recently they were. So what a country will want to do, perhaps, if it wants to enrich uranium, and we're going to see that this comes up over and over again, they will try to acquire this particular technology. There's some other ways to do it, but this is the one that's prevalent right now. So keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to it, the uranium enrichment centrifuge. And by the way, just parenthetically, every one of those little parts that I mentioned, there is a black market in many of those very parts, highly machined to certain tolerances. Sometimes the not quite fully machined part gets shipped from one country to another, where it gets made in, to the perfect size and then goes to a third country. So it's really quite an active area of international illegal commerce. Now, this is a uranium enrichment centrifuge hall, which, again, is rather blurry. Sorry about that. But you get the idea. There are thousands of these uranium enrichment centrifuges, all running in a kind of a cascade, is what they're called, where you have, each one does a little bit of enrichment. The stuff goes on to the next and the next and the next, and eventually you get a product that is enriched to the level you want. Now, this happens to be a civilian uranium enrichment centrifuge facility in the Netherlands, and it's used just to enrich uranium a little bit, just to 3% of the good stuff, because that's what is used in most nuclear power plants like Maine Yankee and Vermont Yankee and all the rest in the United States, and most of the plants around the world. So, there are some legitimate uses for this technology. That's how it was developed. But it can also be used to keep going until you get up to the weapons level. So that's the uranium enrichment route. And let's just spend a second on the plutonium route, which is a little bit different. The plutonium route requires you to take uranium fuel and, in effect, cook it in a reactor, irradiate it. The result is that you have very radioactive spent fuel, which has a lot of unused uranium, but also about 1% plutonium in it. And then you have to take that. The reactors are on the left here. On the right, you'd have a reprocessing plant. And in that facility, you would basically dissolve the fuel in nitric acid, and you do some chemical magic, and you get the plutonium out on one side and the old uranium and some other junk out on another side. These particular reactors are of some interest to me. They are the small one with the rounded top is the Cirrus reactor in India. It's going to be the starting point for the story tonight. It was a reactor given by Canada to India in 1956, started operation in 1960. Canada said to India, you could only have this if you pledged to use it for peaceful purposes. India said, fine, where do we sign? And they did sign up to that arrangement. The one on the left is, but you'll see it was misused. On the left is the Dhruva reactor. It's a little larger. So the Cirrus is about 1 bomb a year of plutonium. The other one's 2.5 or 3 or 4. That one was indigenously built, so there are no restrictions on it. This facility where the men are standing, it's sort of a reprocessing plant. These are hot cells. So basically, the wall in front of the individuals is made out of very, very thick concrete to protect against radioactivity, because behind the wall is where the spent fuel is being processed or other radioactive materials are being processed. And if you can see the individuals, they're sort of rods that are coming down to their hands. They're going up over the wall, so to speak, or through holes, and then down the other side. These are called remote manipulators, so that in effect, if you pick up, you can watch a beaker over there, you can pick it up, you can turn a valve, and you can get some of these processes going without getting a lethal dose of radioactivity. So not only are reactors controlled internationally, and there are all kinds of restrictions on their export, but even in a reprocessing plant, a lot of this technology requires an export license, and it just won't be given to some countries, including these remote manipulators, the kind of glass that's used, with a lot of lead in it, and some of the chemicals that go through the plant. So just to take 2 seconds back, let's go to That's the uranium enrichment approach, and that's the reprocessing approach, and that's the story. That comes up case after case because that is how you make fissile material. There's no secret way to just stumble across it or find a plutonium mine. You've got to do it in this way. And because the technology is so challenging, there are opportunities to intervene to try to stop countries from getting it and actually building nuclear weapons. So I said we ought to look back at the history a little bit. But before we do, there's another constraint or a part of the environment that affects all of these cases. And that would be the international diplomatic environment. In other words, it's not as if people haven't been worrying about this for the last 50 years or 60 years. There have been efforts to figure out how do we control this technology from spreading. And what has emerged is a set of diplomatic tools, I guess, we can call them, known together as the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Now, there's a chemical weapons non-proliferation regime, a missile non-proliferation regime, and a biological weapons non-proliferation regime, but we'll just talk about nuclear. So typically, these start with a very important international treaty, which we have here. It's called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I want to just make sure you know about this because as we talk about individual countries, this is crucial. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was developed and opened for signature in 1968. At that point, 5 countries already had the bomb: the United States, the Soviets, Britain, France, and China. But the nations of the world said, hey, that's enough. If we start having these weapons spread all over the place, it's going to create a horribly dangerous environment, in every region, in Northeast Asia, in Europe, in South America, in Southeast Asia. We should try to design a treaty that will stop this. And so the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was the outcome. It's got some loopholes and some flaws that we'll undoubtedly be touching on. But the core point is the non-nuclear weapon states, as of that moment, that was the time that was the cutoff time. If you had the bomb, you were allowed to keep them with some promises of working toward disarmament over the years. If you didn't have the bomb yet and you joined the treaty, you had to join as a non-nuclear weapon state. So that meant that you pledged not to build a bomb and that you would allow inspectors in to see every nuclear activity that you were engaged in. So I just want to repeat that. You pledge not to do it and the inspectors come in to check. The inspectors are members or employees of the International Atomic Energy Agency based in Vienna. It's a big international organization with 150 or 60 members. Basically, it's like bank auditors. They come in to a nuclear reactor, let's say. They ask how much fuel is on hand, how much is in the core, how much was moved somewhere else, where is it, where did your fuel come from, did we know it was there already? And they can do an inventory and trace the material pretty successfully around an entire country, which they do, as far as we know, successfully in many states, like Japan or Canada or Germany or South Korea or Taiwan. That's all to the good. So that's the core idea. Join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you accept inspections on everything. Well, 3 countries didn't join at that time: India, Pakistan, and Israel. And they decided they didn't want everything inspected, and they eventually used a number of their nuclear installations, like the Sirius reactor, and the Indian case, to manufacture nuclear weapons. And the Dhruva reactor, the second one with the square top, they built that, and they said, that's not going to be inspected. Sorry, we're going to do what we want to do with that. And right now, some of you may know there's a new U.S. Agreement with India that gets into some of these issues, which I won't have time to talk to in my main part of my talk. But the upshot is that the Indians, the Israelis, the Pakistanis made the choice that they just wouldn't join, and they would see what the future held for them. And this has led eventually to their acquisition of nuclear weapons. So that's out there. Then there's something called the Nuclear Suppliers Group, also very important, 54 countries now. These are the ones that actually make some of these widgets, some of these materials, and would like to export them, but they will agree only to export them if they are inspected in the country that gets them. And they have some other restrictions. Certain countries are not really worthy of getting these materials because they're behaving suspiciously, which is the situation we're sort of in now with Iran. So the Nuclear Suppliers Group is there. There's something called the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is a way to interdict stuff that's maybe in transit at an airport, I think I mentioned the Libyan case, that all their stuff was interdicted as they were getting it. That was a Proliferation Security Initiative. It was the German government was contacted. The captain of the ship was German. It went into an Italian port, and the Italians seized the cargo based on intelligence that we had. So it's another part of this effort. And then there's just outright diplomatic engagement. To Gaddafi, if you give up the bomb, we'll give you, we'll end sanctions. To the Ukrainians, if you put these nuclear weapons back in Russia, give them back, then we'll have, we'll have international assistance will come your way, and you'll have security guarantees from the United States and some other countries, including Russia. So there's a lot of diplomatic activity that's just toward the country that we're worried about. All right, so that's the background. And it means basically that any country that wants to try to get nuclear weapons now has to kind of dodge all of these international efforts to stop them in a way that somehow succeeds. So this is a big burden on any country that wants to develop this technology and go all the way home to a nuclear weapon. Typically, it takes a good 10 years for countries to do this. Iran has been at it for 20 now. And it'll depend on the country and how eager they are, what it means to them, and so forth. So that's the sort of the background, the technology and the sort of diplomatic environment in which all of this takes place. So let's now go and talk about what's been going on in some of these countries of concern. I think one starting place for the story is India. India defeated Pakistan in a war in 1971, which led to the dismemberment of Pakistan. The country that is currently Bangladesh used to be East Pakistan. And as a result of the war with India, this was separated and became an independent state. 1974, India detonates a nuclear explosion, first one. As I said, the Cirrus reactor was given to them under peaceful use assurances. They could only use it for peaceful purposes. And don't laugh when I make this comment, because there's a serious point behind it. The Indians said, well, this detonation, which used plutonium produced in this reactor, it wasn't a bomb. It was a peaceful nuclear explosion. It turned out that at the time, the United States and the Soviets were thinking about using nuclear weapons for peaceful purposes, such as building harbors or fracturing gas underground so that you could then pump it out. Of course, it would be rather radioactive. Or for canals and things of this kind. It, of course, was impossible in terms of the politics, but it was being experimented with, and so the Indians said, well, sorry, ours was a peaceful explosion. After that, most countries ended all nuclear trade with India, including the United States. But at that moment, we had a situation in the Netherlands. You recall that I showed you a picture of the Netherlands enrichment plant. The Netherlands, at that point, there was an individual named A.Q. Khan, Abdul Qadir Khan. He was a man of Pakistani origins who had been trained as a metallurgist in Germany and in the Netherlands, and he had a job at that facility. That's the enrichment facility that we saw, the golden colored centrifuges. So it's 1974. Pakistan has just lost a war. India has just tested a bomb. As a patriotic Pakistani, he realized he had something to offer his country. And what he did was in '76, he came home and he brought with him the designs of the centrifuges. And this is why the end caps and the rotors count. He brought home all the suppliers that manufacture the stuff for the Dutch company. So then, slowly, this took 10 years, but slowly but surely, Pakistan built up its own uranium enrichment plant that could do much more than the Dutch one. It didn't just produce fuel for nuclear power plants. It was making fuel for the bomb. And this is an overhead satellite picture. It doesn't show you very much, but it just shows it's a very large-scale facility at Kahuta. Kahuta is the principal place in Pakistan. And A.Q. Khan is the individual who put this together. So from the Pakistani standpoint, he is a national hero. That's understandable. From our standpoint, that is countries that desired that Pakistan would not have nuclear weapons, that would hold the Indians to a single test and get them to stop. This was a very, very unfortunate development. You have to, again, know the history. What was going on at this very time, this is now, he comes home in the late 70s, but the real action starts 79, 80, 81, 82, 83. That is when the Soviets had just invaded Afghanistan. So we needed a partner to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan, Pakistan was prepared to work with us. And of course, much of the challenge that we have today from some of the remnants of the mujahideen that were trained by Pakistan at that point, with our encouragement, with our support, and with some of our weapons, all started then. But it meant that you could only twist Pakistan's arm so far. In other words, if you said to Pakistan, it's over, we're finished, goodbye, what would have happened to our effort to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan? And so trade-offs were made. There was one trade-off, which we learned about later, or at least outsiders learned about. The very week that Pakistan, about 1986, first produced highly enriched uranium. We had very good intelligence, so we knew. In the middle of that period, President Reagan sent an extremely sternly worded warning to the presidency of Pakistan. This must stop. That very month, the CIA was advancing the war in Afghanistan by supplying the next echelon of weaponry to the Mujahideen, the fighters on our side, which were the Stinger missiles, the shoulder-fired missiles that could bring down Soviet helicopters. So we tried. All of those that were working the non-proliferation side of the house, tried to take every step we could to discourage Pakistan, to interfere with its acquisition of these different pieces of technology. But other factors were at play, and it could only be taken so far, and eventually Pakistan prevailed. So this has continued. Pakistan continues to import technology for this facility by clandestine means, usually black market smuggling, and it continues to produce highly enriched uranium, and now the Pakistani nuclear arsenal might be 60 or 80 weapons. No one knows for sure. That sounds small compared to our 6 or 8 or 10,000, but in the context of India versus Pakistan, it's a big number of weapons, and in the context of 2 of them being lost, let's say, to a terrorist group, or the high enriched uranium that they use being lost to a terrorist group, that's a big number. So this is a program of some importance, even though 60 or 80 doesn't sound like a lot of bombs. The smuggling that went on was astonishing. The one that I used to write about this, I did a book that covered this period. There was a shipment of the plant that makes the uranium gas. The plant was shipped to Pakistan in 86 truckloads by a very unscrupulous German seller. So that's what happened. And eventually Pakistan put the story together. As we'll learn shortly, A.Q. Khan then had another idea, which is now that Pakistan had mastered the technology, it was possible for Pakistan, or at least A.Q. Khan, to share it with others. And we'll get to that in just a second. But let's figure out what's happening now. So years have gone by. In 1998, after no tests in Pakistan and no additional tests in India, and a kind of quiet nuclear deterrence between the two countries, India and Pakistan both conducted 7 or 8 tests. The reason, again, was domestic politics. In India, a radical, let me just say a hardline Hindu nationalist party took charge, and they were sick of the restraints on the nuclear program, and they said, it's time for us to show the world what we can do. And they did. Of course, Pakistan then said, well, we can do the same thing, and then they responded. Both countries declared they were nuclear weapon states at that time, which they hadn't done. So there was some element of restraint up to that point. And now we have a country, each with perhaps 60 or 80 weapons, missiles that can be fired at each other, and in the Indian case, probably at China if necessary, and a whole chain of facilities making fissile material in both countries. And of course, one fissile material doesn't quite do everything you want, so both countries have now done the opposite. India started with plutonium, they've now figured out how to enrich uranium, and the Pakistanis started with enriched uranium, and now they're doing some plutonium. But so that's where we are. But let's look at the actual situation. What does it mean in terms of our lives and international policy more generally? Now, again, both of these are not in the NPT, so they're entitled to do this without inspections. But you have an extremely, extremely dangerous situation in this region. The first threat is the threat that India and Pakistan will go to war. Now, that may sound rather abstract, but it nearly happened in 2002. I want to restate that. It nearly happened in 2002. There had been terrorism, which India at least attributes to Pakistani groups that have been fomenting unrest, the Indians believe, in Kashmir, and a group said by the Indians to be Pakistani encouraged attacked the Indian parliament. Well, there have been other attacks like this before, other provocations. This one was astonishing, and you can imagine what it would be like if a terrorist group attacked our Congress. There were no legislators, no parliamentarians were killed, but guards were killed, and it was a pretty serious attack. India was infuriated, as you can imagine, and of course, the way Indian politics worked, the villain was the Pakistani government. So India mounted a major military buildup, and it brought it right to the border. And the Pakistanis, got pretty worried. The Pakistanis had a doctrine which said, if an Indian force moves into Pakistan, we will use nuclear weapons because we're the weaker country. The Indians said, well, if it's only a raid that goes into your country and attacks some terrorist camps, that won't really lead to nuclear escalation. We can do a limited war. It'll be safe. And these two competing doctrines, nuclear doctrines, I mean, that is a recipe for disaster. Because one side thinks it's safe to invade. The other side thinks, hey, we've said nobody invades or else. I mean, even a small, just a border incursion. So the United States intervened diplomatically. It tried to calm both sides. It got the Indians eventually to pull back their forces. But it was touch and go. And there have been three crises like this along the way. So this is very, very serious. And it's the sort of thing that could change tomorrow. There was a horrifying terrorist act in India recently at Varanasi, which is one of the holiest Hindu sites. No one knows who really did it necessarily, but the Indians attribute it to the Pakistanis. And you could imagine some event that maybe is still more serious than that, triggering a real war between the states, between those two states, excuse me. And the other thing to worry about is stability in Pakistan. The leader of Pakistan, President Musharraf, has been the subject of 2 assassination attempts. He was an individual who more or less supported the Taliban and supported a kind of very strong Islamic vision for Pakistan and for the neighboring areas. When we suffered the attack in 9/11 in Pakistan, we asked Pakistan, will you help us in Afghanistan again as we go after the Taliban? And Musharraf made this extremely difficult decision, saying, yes, I will. So he took a very, very dangerous stance, which certainly alienated him from many Pakistanis, to the point where he was subject to 2 assassination attempts. If he were to be killed, if there was to be an eruption of violence in Pakistan, maybe fomented by the Indians, who's to say, you don't know what would happen to that society. And if the society were to, there was a period of chaos, if there was a new government that came to power that might be more radical, let's say, than Musharraf, you don't know what's going to happen to their nuclear materials or their nuclear weapons. So this is acutely dangerous. And it's the sort of thing, again, the Iranian case we'll talk about, real bad, but it's a ways off. This thing could go up in flames tomorrow, and it's really very, very troubling. And what's also troubling is that how do we deal with this? What do you do to bring stability to Pakistan, to make Musharraf more popular? How do you really suppress the possibility of Pakistani-supported terrorism when the government tells you it's not us? These are not easy things for the United States and its friends to do. It's not like cutting off nuclear trade or putting somebody in jail. This is a very, very difficult problem to solve, and it's an extremely volatile one. So I'm going to leave India-Pakistan there. There's a new deal between the United States and India we can talk about in a minute or two, but I wanted to just emphasize the extreme danger here. But let's talk about Iran. Gee, you may recognize a certain illustration on this slide as well. Iran was the beneficiary of A.Q. Khan's largesse. In 1988, he provided Iran with old sort of models of Pakistani centrifuges, designs, a nuclear weapon design. China had helped Pakistan to get the bomb, and with the bomb design, that we believe was transferred to Iran. And Iran then began a very secret effort to master the uranium enrichment capability, the technology. The missile I have there is called the Shahab-3. It's able to reach Israel, and they're building a longer one able to reach Europe, a longer range one called the Shahab-4. Countries don't build missiles like this unless they use them with weapons of mass destruction. They're too expensive. So that's what you're seeing here, I believe, plus the 18 years of secret efforts to build up this uranium enrichment capability. So in 2002 or so, word leaked out as to what was going on in Iran. Among other activities was the Natanz site. And this is a satellite image of Natanz. The large dark squares to the right are the centrifuge halls, just like the ones that I showed you the picture of, with thousands of centrifuges, supposedly to provide fuel for a nuclear energy program that Iran is going to have one day, but in reality, probably for something else. The buildings over to the right with the numbers on them are buildings that manufacture small numbers of centrifuges, test them out, and try to build a cascade of about 160, which is where we are at the moment. That is exactly what Iran is attempting today, March 28th, is to get 160 of these to work. It's going to need thousands, but it's got to get them all to work together. Each one has to produce a little bit of enrichment and then move the product on to the next, and so forth. There's so many stories to tell here, but basically the latest wrinkle in the clandestine acquisition of material by Iran was $35 million of equipment that was routed through, I think it was 35, it may have been more, 350. It was routed through Sudan, which basically has no export controls. We don't know quite where that's going. All right, this is the particularly disturbing view graph that I wanted to, sorry here. All right, just keep that image in your mind and look at this image. This is Natanz also. Over here, everything is covered. This is being covered with reinforced concrete and earth, and then more reinforced concrete and more earth, in order to make it impossible to attack, or at least very difficult to attack. The mouse overs, the yellow lines, show you the facilities that we saw on the last slide. They've now been covered over. This is over the last couple of years. The first picture was 2002. This is now relatively current. Over here, new buildings that didn't exist before. You can see that next to the large construction area, there were no buildings. Now there are several. So work has been going on. Now, how do you deal with a problem like this? Here we have one benefit, and that is that the country is a party to the Nonproliferation Treaty, and therefore everything in the country is supposed to be under inspection. So when it leaked out that all of these facilities weren't under inspection, the international community was, sort of rose up and said, this has got to change. Inspectors came in and really surveyed the country very effectively. By and large, Iran was helpful, although a couple of spots still stayed off limits. And in one case, by the time the inspectors got there, it had been raised, and every scrap of evidence that there might have been nuclear activities was removed. So for a period of time, as I mentioned earlier about domestic politics being important, for a period of time, the Iranians froze the program. And the IAEA put seals on every centrifuge so they couldn't spin, and locked doors and all the rest. And for a period, everything was on hold while negotiations continued, which was okay, because they don't have material yet for nuclear weapons, and they don't have a large enrichment plant. They're just trying. However, just as we were working to try to figure out some negotiated solution that would be satisfactory to all sides and keep this technology from being developed, because once it's in the hands of Iran, it could always withdraw from the Nonproliferation Treaty, and then it would have the facility and any enriched uranium that it might have made. So in this case, things were going pretty well until the Iranians had an election, as I may have said, and they brought in a much more radical leader who had a much more confrontational attitude. And he began to unfreeze stuff. So the plant that was making the gas to go into the centrifuges, frozen before he came to power, unfrozen after he came to power. Extensive IAEA inspections, well beyond what was legally mandatory, permitted by the old government, restricted and eliminated by the new government. Centrifuge research, actually operating centrifuges with gas, uranium gas in them, frozen under the previous government, and it is now starting. So, I mean, literally today, as we were all enjoying this phenomenal weather here, at the UN in New York, the Security Council is meeting to see what to do about this. The IAEA said there's been a violation. The Security Council needs to sort of take charge now, and we don't know how this is going to turn out. What we want is to really, I'm going to exaggerate this, we want to really, really threaten Iran so it will back down and adopt the policy of the previous government, which is a freeze. All right. The way we want to do that is to get a resolution from the Security Council which says this activity that we have on the screen here, that constitutes a threat to international peace and security, which is basically the code for it's such a threat you can use force to eliminate it. Now, we don't want to use force because that's not very practical, but we want the authority to do so that Iran will be intimidated and will pull back. And we are hearing that there are voices in Iran that are not happy with the new government's policies, and it might be possible to change things around. Unfortunately, as all of you know, the Security Council operates, there's a veto system. The five major powers each has a veto. So to get this to work, we don't only need our friends, France and Great Britain, who have the veto, but also China and Russia. Russia is particularly reluctant to introduce sanctions or anything that might hint at the possibility of action of some kind against Iran, because it has billions of dollars in contracts with the Iranians right now. $1 billion in arms sales. Typically, the UN might impose an arms embargo on a state that was violating international norms. $1 billion of important arms sales that the Russians have. It also has a large reactor at Bushehr, a nuclear power plant, which it's constructing, and by the way, for which it was going to supply the uranium, the enriched uranium from outside, and take it back afterwards, so that would have been pretty safe. So Russia is definitely slowing the process down and doesn't want this to happen. Anyhow, if you read the paper tomorrow morning, you'll find the next installment of what I don't want to over-dramatize this, but it's a pretty gripping yarn. If Iran gets the bomb, just think of the trouble they could make. You remember the Pakistanis when they thought, I don't want to overstate what they've done, but once the Pakistanis had nuclear weapons, they thought they were immune from retaliation from India. And therefore, they opened the possibility, it opened the possibility for Pakistan, and I'm not saying this occurred, but it opened the possibility for what would be called low-level violence against an adversary, with the expectation that they would never lead to a nuclear escalation. If Iran got nuclear weapons, you could have a situation where the same thing happened, where terrorist organizations that Iran might support could make much more mischief than they do now, and Iran would say it's okay because no one's going to come and attack us to retaliate. So that's very dangerous. And then in Iran, you have the problem of the chain of command being uncertain. We don't quite know who is running this part of the country. We don't know quite what the power structure is. And it could be that there might be a break in the power structure, as there was in Pakistan. And someone who has different views, perhaps, than a more moderate government goes off and does something with these materials. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. And as I say, it's unfolding, literally as we're sitting here. Now, North Korea, just to close up, is that's the easy case. We don't have much we can do there right now. North Korea, let me just see if I have one more slide here. This is the North Korean situation, and again, I don't want to just belabor this, but there's a reactor that's on the left, and there's a reprocessing plant on the right, and that's how they're making nuclear weapons. The Clinton administration negotiated, basically under the threat of war, negotiated a deal that froze the program. So this was taken extremely seriously back in the early 1990s when this came to light. Unfortunately, as that program was frozen, the plutonium program, it turned out, centrifuge, a third beneficiary of the AQCON network was North Korea. This appears to have been done in perhaps in exchange for North Korea providing missiles to Pakistan so that it could have a deterrent. We don't know quite what the status of this program is in North Korea, but it led the Bush administration to say, hey, this freeze doesn't work, you guys are cheating, we're not going to continue this, and then the whole deal unraveled. And so the North Koreans went back to doing this. We have an enterprise underway called the Six-Party Talks, which are negotiations to try to get a deal in North Korea like the deal we had with Libya, which is we'll end sanctions, we'll integrate you into the world economy, we'll provide economic assistance, so will Japan, so will South Korea. Isn't this really what your country needs? Not nuclear weapons. But these talks have just languished and nothing much has happened. Now we're trying to put pressure on North Korea by using law enforcement techniques to go after counterfeiting activities and drug smuggling that they're engaged in. So this is a real stalemate right now. There may be 6 or 8 weapons there, small arsenal, but still very, very challenging. So let me sort of wrap up. I see I've gone on longer than I should have, but just the real themes here are there is a story that always unfolds. It always has the same elements, but the answer is uncertain. And by various interventions, such as sanctions, maybe incentives, maybe changes of government, maybe external alteration in the threats that a country perceives, it's possible to change behavior. And that's sort of what we are engaged in. That is to say, we that are attempting to slow the spread of these weapons. Over time, things have changed a little bit. This is perceived much more now as an actual threat to the United States. I don't think the Brazilian bomb was ever perceived, if they built one, as a threat. So this has also taken on a bit more of an edge and a bit greater urgency than it may have had at an earlier period, 15 years ago. But right now, it's a very, very serious matter. It commands the President's attention, the Secretary of State and Defense, and is a very serious challenge for the United States and for many other countries. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
All right, that was a very rich presentation. I'm sure there are lots of questions, so please.
Yes, sir.
What would you say are the delivery capabilities of India and Pakistan versus, say, a state like the United States or Britain or the US?
Well, the major, if I can call them the major powers, the P5 and the Security Council, the first 5 to get the bomb, eventually developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, pretty much. In other words, you could go all the way across the world to hit the adversary. So from North Dakota, you could hit Moscow, in effect. Most of the countries that are now emerging as nuclear powers have shorter range systems, but in their region, they are just as deadly. In other words, you don't need an intercontinental missile to hit, let's say, to hit Tehran from Israel, and vice versa. You don't need an intercontinental missile to hit Lahore from Indian territory. That's just 50 kilometers away. So these countries tend to have shorter range systems. What people are wondering about is, why is Iran getting a system which can go beyond the Middle East and perhaps reach Europe or even go intercontinental at some point? The North Koreans did one experiment with one missile where they tried to launch a satellite. And that missile, the Taepodong-2, could theoretically carry a warhead against at least the westernmost part of the United States. They haven't tested it since, but that is out there as a possibility, and that's one of the reasons, I don't know if you follow this, why we're trying to develop missile defenses. It's particularly because of that North Korean threat. Yes, sir?
A little bit about the Israeli nuclear program. Have you officially acknowledged that they have one?
No, Israel is the only country to have it that does not acknowledge it. It adopted the strategy originally as a way of avoiding international criticism. It just kind of kept it beneath the surface. And then gradually information leaked out about it. From the Israeli, the reason behind it, from the Israeli perspective, was that in the early period of Israeli statehood, this is the late 40s and the 50s, the situation on the ground for Israel in terms of the conventional forces that Israel had versus the surrounding Arab states was extremely disadvantageous for Israel. And so they, in order to establish permanence of themselves and to get other countries to recognize that they were not going to go away, they went and developed this capability. There are a lot of sort of stories about the history of this, but the essential history is that after the Suez Crisis of 1956, when the Soviets threatened France and the UK and the United States did not support their effort to take back the Suez Canal from Egypt, the French decided they needed a bomb of their own, and the Israelis were also very vulnerable, and they made common cause. And so the Dimona reactor in Israel was built by the French, and there's other transfers of technology. This is all quite well known. It's my understanding and my belief that the United States never helped. And in fact, in the early stages, we learned about the Dimona reactor under construction. This is the Eisenhower administration. And the Kennedy and Johnson administrations tried to stop the bomb program. But, we don't know how hard it was done and how far it went. At one stage, it looks as if we were going to offer a lot of conventional arms to Israel, and we hoped that would make the change, but it never quite came off. I think that's when Kennedy was assassinated, and Johnson didn't pick it up. So, yes, ma'am.
What do you think is the most important next step?
Well, I mean, let's look at this together. I mean, you've got a situation here where I hate to be quoted on television, but we haven't succeeded in the case of North Korea yet. They have 6 or 8 nuclear weapons. That was a real setback. We had a situation in Iraq after the first Gulf War where they had cheated for a decade, and they had started to build the nuclear weapons program, and then, of course, the war occurred and it was gone. And then we assumed, mistakenly, of course, that they were continuing that in the late 1990s. So that history of Iraq isn't very reassuring. Iran operated clandestinely for 18 years, and nobody found it until quite recently. So I'd say, we need to sort of work together with other countries that are worried about this to try to bring back some discipline and some effectiveness to the non-proliferation regime. And that's why I would say, what really matters now is how the UN reacts. You all have studied the history of the 1930s. There were moments when, Hitler could have been stopped, and I don't want to make the comparison directly between Iran and Hitler, but I'm just saying there are times when international events occur of great potential danger, and states have to decide, is this the time we step up and we do something very dramatic or not? Right now we're in a terrible situation because we just did that, and it was erroneous in the case of Iraq. So in an instance like Iran, it's very hard to muster an international effort to really come down hard and, let's say, threaten sanctions on Iran until they will actually relent and give up the bomb. So I'd say this is really crucial. If it turns out that the United Nations simply does nothing and this bomb program proceeds, that says not only does Iran have nuclear weapons, but more or less anybody can do it because the international community won't react. So I'd say this is really crucial right now, that we get this right. And I want to just be explicit. I'm not advocating military force, and I did not want to malign Iran. It just represents a danger for us, and I think for the whole effort to attempt to keep a lid on the spread of this technology. The AQCon network has more or less been rolled up, but the blueprints are out there on somebody's CD-ROM, and this stuff is going to spread unless we can bring some discipline back into the system. Yes, in the back?
What's your position on the U.S.'s possession of nuclear weapons in general, and do you think that not only the U.S. but also the other powers that have nuclear weapons kind of in the region, do you think that this empowers us in the UN in these negotiations?
Well, first of all, the P5 now consists of, that's the permanent 5 members of the Security Council with the veto, the United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China. But China was not always a member. The original representative of that part of the world was the nationalist government on Taiwan. So membership in the Security Council had to do not explicitly with nuclear weapons. There were other political factors that were the touchstone. I guess my sense is that well, this is the first chart I was going to show. I'll go back to it now. What's happening, and you may not perceive this here, and I know I was startled to kind of realize it, I must say. The administration, this is the Bush administration that is very forceful and prepared to use military force, has really adopted a strategy which is to reduce the importance of nuclear weapons in the American military system. This was shown by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, this slide at a conference I attended. And basically, if you go across the top, the question is asked, who threatens us and who do we want to deter? Well, first we have the peer or the emerging peer. Well, that's Russia or China. Those are countries like us that have perhaps arsenals that are big enough to really threaten us. All right, so for those countries, you got to try to deter the leadership and the military commanders, and nuclear weapons play a role because they have them too, and that's been the history. But as you go across the slide, this is where the military is truly focused today. They're focused on dealing with a country like, Iraq recently, North Korea perhaps, Iran, and trying to figure out how do we contain them and avoid their making mischief on the international stage. One way is to deter them, but these countries do not need to be deterred with nuclear weapons. They can be deterred with our conventional forces, and that's what we're working on, to get our munitions more accurate, to be able to have very little collateral damage, very few civilians killed, so that the other side's leadership thinks if we go to war, they're the ones that are going to be targeted, and we're not going to be just focused willy-nilly on the general population. And then you have violent extremists on the far right, and that's another problem. Nuclear weapons are utterly irrelevant to that threat. And this is where the money is being spent, the brain power is being expended. It's on these other threats rather than, let's say, with Russia and with China. And so it's a situation where I think I can say, we need to hold on to these weapons for a while. We should be reducing them. We should take them off hair trigger alert. We should make sure we're complying with the obligation of the Nonproliferation Treaty to negotiate these reductions and keep going in that direction. But I'd say for the moment, we're going to be stuck with them, and we have to do our work with Iran and with North Korea, even though these are part of the background. And sometimes, as I've said earlier, we're successful. So I don't think these will go away, but I don't think we want to brandish them. And I think there's a term that a colleague coined called recessed deterrence, where everybody knows you've got them, but you're not sort of waving them and say, watch out. And I think that's the direction we should be heading in. So I hope that answers the question a bit. Yes, sir.
You said that military intervention is largely considered impractical in Iran. Doesn't Iran also kind of know that? And if they do kind of know that, what can we really use to intimidate them?
Well, you've asked a very important question. I think we need to look back to what happened in Iraq in 1981. This is when Iraq had a single reactor, the Osirak reactor. The Israelis bombed it. Okay, so for a while the Iraqi program was set back, but then throughout the 1980s, the Iraqis came back. They dug further underground. They were more clandestine, and by 1990, when we had the war, they had built a lot. They hadn't got the bomb. So I think everyone knows if you did the same thing to Iran tomorrow, you would antagonize the population. You would, you set back the program briefly, but it would not be a permanent setback. And you're going to confront this again, maybe with a much more angry and mobilized and unified Iran than we confront today. And there's also the problem of getting all the sites. They operated clandestinely for 18 years, and we still don't know if we've observed every site that they have. These centrifuges are not that large, and you could build a clandestine location. So, and then there's also just the physical difficulty of hitting some of these sites like Natanz. So I would say that's the reasons not to do it. You're saying, how do we negotiate if we don't at least have that as a possibility? I'd say it's always a possibility. From time to time, the whispers go out that the Israelis might do it, et cetera. But I think this is a very, very distant prospect, especially with our troops tied down in Iraq, and where the international community is sort of not so happy with our behavior in Iraq that they would support us in a military action against Iran. So I think that's why, again, the question was asked, what's the most important next thing? It's the diplomacy in the UN, unified against Iran to get some changes so that we can avoid this possibility. Yes, ma'am?
Did the U.S. violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty with its dealings with India, and what's your sort of general...
You must have been reading my materials here. The Non-Proliferation Treaty says that a country with the bomb, the 5 that were allowed to keep them, must not aid in any way another country that does not have nuclear weapons to get them. So right now, under a deal that's being negotiated between the U.S. government and the Indian government, we will open nuclear trade with India, which we had embargoed for many years, on the civilian side under inspection. And there has been an argument that because there is a limited quantity of uranium in India, by supplying a lot of uranium for the civilian side, in effect we've allowed India, given it a free hand in using all of its uranium, not for energy, but for weapons programs. I have tried to make that argument, and I have, because I don't like this deal, but I think it's a tough call, because the theory is the Indians would always use it for the nuclear weapon program first, and they would forsake, if they had to, some of the nuclear energy. So you're not really actually contributing to the nuclear weapon program. You're just sort of making it a little, you're avoiding their having to sacrifice something else. So that's a pretty long stretch. And I guess I would have to say, although I may argue it someday, I think probably this is not a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there are things we could do that would be, like if we taught them how to design a weapon or to make a weapon safer by showing them the insides and so they wouldn't go off by accident, which has been discussed. I mean, that would be, really forbidden.
Doesn't it also, I've heard that it violated laws Congress has passed about nuclear?
Yes, well, I can speak with some pride about that since I helped to draft the law. It was quite a while ago. The current law says that the United States will not sell nuclear equipment or materials to any country which is a non-nuclear weapon country under the definitions of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. So the definition includes India and Pakistan and Israel. We won't sell to those countries unless they put everything under inspection, which of course these countries won't do. That's the law that we have, and it was a position adopted by the Nuclear Suppliers Group in 1992. They've all said the same thing. So all that has to get changed now in order to allow nuclear commerce with India. And there's a big debate about this. Condi Rice will testify next week. Senior members of the administration testified, I think, this morning on this. And, we're all arguing about it. I'm part of the old guard. I want to see the embargo continued. But there are some reasonable arguments on the other side. And but it's going to take time. And then we have to negotiate an agreement with the Indians. And then the Nuclear Suppliers Group has to change its rules. So this thing is going to take a while, and I imagine some new conditions and restrictions will be added to the deal from, this is I didn't set him up, okay? But we just finished, I was saying to Alison Stanger, Professor Stanger, that we just finished a study at the Monterey Center. And in fact, this is a study that really exploited our great skills, which is we went around the world to see what countries were saying about the India deal. And the footnotes to this article are I didn't do these footnotes, but I'll just brag about it. There are footnotes where the text of the footnote is in Korean, because it was a Korean journal, Korean language journal, Arabic language journals, Farsi, and others. And we put this whole story together. And it turns out that countries have been cautious about what they're saying, but the media and the kind of public at large, often controlled by governments, so there's some crossover, they have repeatedly used the phrase, the United States is implementing a double standard. In the case of India, which is a friend, it's prepared to bend all the rules to allow nuclear commerce, and it turns a blind eye to the fact that India has the bomb. But in the case of Iran, which is perceived as an enemy and it's an Islamic state, then the United States pulls out all of its wrath and it tries to use every tool that it can to hold them in check. And this is hard. And the Iranians, of course, as I said, we had Farsi. The Iranians said, hey, look what the United States is doing to us. We're being singled out. We're a member of the Nonproliferation Treaty. We're entitled to have peaceful nuclear technology, including enrichment. We're allowing it to be inspected. And yet here we are being identified as the villain, when over there, a country that actually built the bomb, and by the way, they don't say this, but we can say it, with a little cheating of its own, they're getting rewarded. The rules are being bent in their behalf. So this is definitely not convenient, if I may say that. The trouble was the president happened to have a visit to India, which was March 2nd, and the matter happened to come on the Iranian side to the Security Council around the same time, and the awkwardness of this dichotomy is being constantly reiterated. So it's it's unfortunate that this has happened, and I think we would have an easier time if we were applying the rules strictly and were perceived to be doing it more even-handedly. So, yes, sir, on the right with the beard.
I'm going to make it short. I'm aiming at two of the things that you mentioned. One of them was the fact that you believe in the effectiveness of diplomacy, and the other one about the fact that Iran changed a lot of its policies after the president was changed. The first comment is that I personally don't think that it was much of a fundamental change, especially because the tone, I think it was the tone that was changed, and the
Well, I think you raise a couple of very important issues. First of all, the previous Iranian government was not happy that it was accepting all of these inspections, not happy that there was international pressure. And it certainly, I mean, it was the government in part that was bringing all this nuclear activity up to the point when it was stopped. So it certainly was, wanted this program. But my impression was that that government had other voices that were pretty prominent, such as the oil industry, which wanted smooth sailing for oil exports and did not want to have the relationships with the West or others roiled by the nuclear deal. My guess is we could have worked out a moratorium. This is, in other words, a freeze of some, not a permanent freeze, but we probably could have negotiated a declaration in which Iran says, as a matter of sovereign right and as a matter of voluntary goodwill, we are going to postpone our enrichment program for until our first nuclear power plant has come online and we see if this technology works, 3 or 4 years. And the other side would have said, that's absolutely intolerable, we want a permanent freeze, but okay, we'll take the deal. So I think there was room to bargain where the principle that the old Iranian government stood for, as you commented, could have been protected, and still we could have had a workout. But I think with this particular government, that's just harder. It may change. It may be that as the government settles in, many governments come to office and they really kind of go overboard with their ideological views, and it's not only the case in some Middle East countries. So it may be that what we'll see here is a moderation, just in the natural course of things, of the Ahmadinejad government, but we don't know. I'm sorry, the second point was the
fact that there is
Iraq. Well, absolutely. I mean, so here's what happened. As we took this matter, we pressed to have the matter brought from the International Atomic Energy Agency up to the Security Council, where at least there was a risk, a danger that there might be sanctions imposed against Iran. Iran said, if you do that and you think you can cause us pain, we can cause you pain too. What has happened since then? The most horrifying acts of violence. I mean, there are many acts of violence that were horrible, but I think in the recent month we have seen a real upsurge. Now, that could have been because of the destruction of the Shiite mosque, but if it wasn't, it could have been that, in effect, a restraining influence that Iran was exercising in Iraq, they didn't restrain, and they allowed these things to happen. I'm not saying it did occur, but it's the sort of thing where they have some leverage too. So I don't know. I think at least publicly these are on two different tracks. And it could be, however, and actually you raised a great point, because what just happened was we agreed to some talks with Iran on the Iraq issue, where we know we've got a big issue to negotiate. And undoubtedly, as the negotiators get together on that subject, there'll be some discussions behind the scenes on the nuclear front. So thank you for raising the point. That's something I should have included. Yes, sir.
I'd like to carry on from there. I would agree with what you said, that military force is not an option at all. And I basically agree that sanctions will not be an issue either, because it's very hard to implement and get all the parties, and especially recognizing that Russia is highly invested in Iran. So what are the main what are the incentives that could be offered to the current Iranian administration or any Iranian administration to back down or at least slow its pace towards obtaining a nuclear weapon, if there are any incentives?
Well, I think, I can do this. I can come up with a list that would be pretty attractive, I think. But you just don't know if it's attractive enough, because now this has become a matter of principle for the Iranian government. One thing that the Europeans who were negotiating the freeze, and were pretty successful for a while, offered was a major trade agreement between the European Union and Iran that would sort of lock in a strong trade relationship and eliminate a lot of the problems that have arisen. We have all kinds of sanctions against Iran. Those could be moderated in some fashion. We don't have diplomatic relations with Iran. That could change. And we used all of these tools in our negotiations, unsuccessful, but they were on the table in our negotiations with North Korea, and they're on again. In the North Korean case, it's called the grand bargain. You more or less alter the relationship between yourself and the other country, and you hope that in that context the country will give you something, which would be the bomb program, and it worked in the case of Libya. So you don't quite know when things are going to click. The offer was out there with the Libyans for a long time, and they only chose to go for it as as they got caught with the bomb material or the BCC China and so forth. So I'd say it's doable. It never quite got to the point of concreteness. The Iranians said what the Europeans were offering was never concrete enough. So my thought is, all right, if that's what we're worried about, that's something we can negotiate, and we should be able to get a solution. But again, you just don't quite know what the agenda of the other side might be. So, yes, sir.
Speak up, please. We can't hear you.
Just in case you couldn't hear, the question was, will Israel use force against Iran? Boy, I don't know. I think it gets mentioned from time to time, but this is really difficult. And I don't mean this, just think of what actually has to occur. You can't get to Iran without overflying other countries that are not going to be very happy about this. It's extremely hard to do in secret. And it's not just one raid on one facility, like the Israeli raid on the Osirak reactor back in 1981. This, you've got to knock out facility after facility after facility. You almost certainly need our help with some overhead imagery and some other things. So I think this is it's quite unlikely. It could happen, but it would be tough to do. And if it didn't finish the job, which it might very well not accomplish, you've only made matters worse by as I say, unifying the Iranian people against Israel even more than they might be today. So I think this is a very difficult possibility. It gets mentioned, but I just think it's not practical, and I'm not sure it would be a winning proposition, but it could occur. So, yes, sir. I'll get to you next.
I think you've already asked a question.
Okay. Should we go in the back? Absolutely. You gave me right. The question was, did the U.S. did the U.S. operate on reasonable belief when it went into Iraq to eliminate a possible nuclear weapons threat, or was it just totally erroneous and really just an excuse to go in? I will just tell you what I just had a personal experience on this in an odd way. The book I used to write every year or so was a review of which countries were getting nuclear weapons and what stage of the story they were at. In 1990, I wrote a book which at that point was based on pretty good information as understood by the U.S. government. And the rule was, Iraq is very interested, but it ain't making much progress. And we were totally wrong. I hope that chapter of my book has kind of evaporated or something. We were absolutely wrong. The inspectors went in after that war. They found all kinds of stuff. And that left all of us that were involved in this in one way or another, as a scholar or as a diplomat or official, you said, we're not going to let that happen again. Okay, so the inspectors remained in Iraq until 1998, and then Iraq basically throws them out, and we had another one of these crises as to whether the UN would stand up and put them back in. And everybody said, gee, look, Saddam was so gung-ho on nuclear, chemical, bio back in the 1980s. The inspectors are gone. He's going to do it again. There was no question in my mind personally that that's where we were headed. I don't know that they would have made enough progress to merit a war, but the notion that this thing was quiescent, that there was no activity, I simply would not have believed that as of, let's say, the year 2000 or 2001. It was such an obvious opportunity for Saddam, and we knew there was all kinds of cheating going on in the oil for food program, where he siphoned off money and he was smuggling stuff in. Armaments were coming in through Jordan. It was a chaotic situation. So we all imagined this was what was happening. And then, this kind of reasonable belief kind of took on the nature of truth. And when it came to something as important as a war, I think the administration and outsiders too allowed themselves to get swept up when we really should have held back. We had a moment when we could have, which was when we had troops in the region. The inspectors were in really, they were back and looking very hard for nuclear materials and others. They found nothing on the nuclear front. The problem was we just couldn't keep troops there indefinitely, and these were large numbers of troops. So, we all know the outcome. So I think this was, exaggeration and overstatement. In fact, but I don't know that people did it knowingly in many cases. And I certainly, I was stunned. There's an individual, David Kay, who I consider to be something of a hero in this area. He stood up to Saddam. He was at a parking lot. He had boxes of documents when he was an inspector in 1991. His whole group could have been, assassinated or God knows what, or kidnapped. And he insisted that they take these documents and materials and do the inspection. And he said, absolutely, there are going to be weapons. And he was incredibly persuasive before the war this time, that there are going to be weapons there. We've got to go after Saddam now, or it's going to be too late. And then he made the most eloquent explanation that it just wasn't true, and he was responsible for looking at things after the fact, and there was nothing there. So I think for many individuals this was a legitimate error. Whether the government as a whole went beyond that and over characterized the situation, I think I'll defer judgment on. But there was some of that, but whether that was really sufficient. I mean, Congress wasn't going to buy it unless they had a sense that Saddam was up to no good. So I think there was a predilection in this direction.
Well, thank you so much
Good.
for a fantastic.
Thank you. Good.